Hey guys, it's Villain Theory with my first video in what I'm calling Villain Season, which technically unofficially started with the podcast about difficult villains with Web Warrior Fanatic and Nelson, so check that out, Shadow of the Cast if you haven't. But this is the first proper video in that series where we're talking about, scenarios and mod sets, and what is more common to include in a scenario than the standard set. And we now have three standard sets, Standard 1, Standard 2, which we won't really be talking about here, and Standard 3, which has been a very popular new addition to the game. And what are the differences? Well, we're going to talk about that, what the impact is on gameplay, the difficulty changes, and when you maybe shouldn't use one of these standard sets over the other one. Mainly talking about Standard 3, but of course it's being compared to Standard 1, so that will kind of be in all of the discussion. So what's the big difference? Standard 1 has this card called Shadow of the Past, which is probably the most feared card in Marvel Champions overall from most players, I would say, and it reveals your Nemesis minion and Nemesis side scheme, and then puts 3 nasty encounter cards in the encounter deck. Getting a big minion and a nasty side scheme, most of which are built to kind of counter your hero specifically, the player who reveals the Nemesis. That's pretty bad. It's kind of like 2 encounter cards in one, except they're kind of designed to beat you. Then we've got Pursued by the Past, which is a permanent setup environment. So this is never in the encounter deck, it just sits there, and you add counters to it from the rest of the cards in Standard 3. So there are 7 cards in the encounter deck from Standard 3, just like there are 7 from Standard 1, and each of them add a counter, and when you have enough, then the Nemesis enters play. So what does this mean? Well, both of them will have the Nemesis minion and side scheme happen, and both will bring in the whole Nemesis set. Shadow of the Past is just there. It can hit you on turn 1, or it might not even hit you by turn 15. If it comes up as a boost card, you're completely safe until the encounter deck resets. Pursued by the Past is very unlikely to hit you in the first few turns, but it is very, very likely to bring out your Nemesis. So the Nemesis is a lot more common, but a lot less common early on. And it's a lot more gradual. You kind of see it building up and softly plan around it. So Pursued by the Past is kind of consistent and steady, whereas Shadow of the Past is inconsistent and quite swingy, quite kind of out there, can just turn 1 ruin your game sometimes. So that's kind of the big difference between these sets, because the rest of the Standard 1 and Standard 3 set are kind of just versions of each other. There are slight differences, there are a couple of cards which are different, but let's have a look at that for the most part and see how Standard 3 works quickly. We've got Assault and Advance, which basically say the villain activates, they attack or scheme, and in Standard 3, we have equivalent Sinister Strike and Dark Designs, which basically say, the villain attacks or the villain schemes. But there are some differences, and I'm ignoring boost effects for this. I'm talking about the when revealed effects at the moment. So, Dark Designs, the last words on the when revealed effect, say the villain schemes, just like Advance. So, in that regard, they're no different. But Dark Design says, place 1 pursuit counter on Pursued by the Past first. Then, if it has any counters still on Pursued by the Past, the villain schemes. What does that mean? If I've placed a pursuit counter on Pursued by the Past, it obviously has a counter on it. How could, the villain not scheme? Well, here's how Pursued by the Past works. You need to add 3 counters on more than the number of players to bring in that Nemesis set. When the Nemesis set is brought in, you wipe all the counters off of Pursued by the Past, which effectively means if you have, let's say, you're in solo play, you need 4 counters to bring in that Nemesis set. If you have 3 counters on it, you just need 1 more. Every Standard 3 kind of when revealed effect in the encounter deck basically becomes Shadow of the Past. That 1 counter they add on, it's going to bring in the Nemesis set, just as if you had drawn shadows, and that is pretty scary. So you effectively go from having no shadows in the encounter deck to every card is a copy of Shadow of the Past, and then it resets. So if Dark Designs adds that final counter on to Pursued by the Past, brings in your Nemesis, all the counters get wiped off, the villain won't scheme. Dark Designs has effectively transformed from Advance into Shadow of the Past. So that's the big kind of difference between us and how this encounter set works. And now I'm going to hit you with some nerdy numbers. So this chart and all the numbers you're going to see here, in the subsequent parts, are from a viewer called Royal7. They are a really fantastic part of the community. They are, maybe not spoken about very often, but, if you need help with what comics to read, they are going to probably be one of your best bets to help you out. And they're very good with numbers. So let's have a look at this chart here. So this is Standard 1 versus Standard 3. This is the chance to bring in your Nemesis set. On the left is the percentage, chance per turn, with the bottom row being, the turn. So on turn 3, we can see that Standard 3, which is the orange line, has a very, very low chance still to bring in your Nemesis set. Whereas Standard 1 On a standard 1, it's basically, just Shadow of the Past we're talking about here. So you have a very steady chance to get your nemesis in play throughout. You're not going to gradually build up counters and then suddenly it's very likely. It's just going to be, maybe I'll get Shadow of the Past this turn, or maybe I won't. And I should say, this chart has quite a lot of assumptions. It is not a perfect chart for every single situation, but it is a good kind of rough outline. So this is a solo play chart. This is assuming the encounter deck has 30 cards. Some have over 40, so your mileage, it will vary depending on the scenario. But, the bigger the encounter deck, the more diluted the standard cards are, you're still getting a reduced chance for Shadow of the Past, as you are getting a reduced chance to add counters onto Pursued by the Past. So I'd say it roughly evens out. It doesn't take Surge into account, which gives you, a higher chance at encounter cards over boost cards, so Shadow of the Past becomes a little bit more likely. So, long story short, not perfect for every situation, but a really good general kind of look. And I should say 0.25 means 25%. So by turn 4 with standard 3, you basically have a 25% chance to see your nemesis. And to get that with standard 1, with Shadow of the Past, you need to basically get to turn 8, which kind of highlights how much more consistent, how much more often standard 3 brings in your nemesis set. And by the time you get to turn 8 with standard 3, you're more like an 80% chance to have seen your nemesis set, which is crazy. But there is something else we can see here. With standard 3, it's very less likely to see your nemesis set by turn 3 than with standard 1. So if you're playing a rush deck, let's say you're playing Wolverine Aggression, and you're playing on standard, difficulty mode, not expert, you might see your nemesis set a lot less with standard 3 compared to standard 1, just because you're not given the game time to build up those counters. But I'd say most decks in most situations, a regularly paced deck against a regular length scenario, standard 3 is making your nemesis a lot more common. And we might be able to see that more easily here when we look at the numbers into, kind of spreadsheet form. So by turn 3, standard 1, you've got a 10% chance to have seen your nemesis set into play. Standard 3 is just a 3.4% chance. But let's skip to, let's say, turn 6. Standard 1, maybe 18% chance. And, this is still just one boost card, one encounter card. Things can change that. Standard 3, though, 54.4%, which is huge. That's a huge difference. Even if some things do happen to affect, how many boost cards you see, how many encounter cards you see, overall standard 3 is just going to be a lot more likely to bring in your nemesis. It's just overwhelming. And I should reiterate, this chart and, this kind of spreadsheet thing here, this is all for solo play. For multiplayer, things get a lot crazier. Now, the amount of counters you need on Pursued by the Past does change, so you can't just scale up this graph exactly. But here's the thing. In solo play, you need 4 counters. In 4-player, you need 7 counters. It doesn't scale proportionally, and yet you're seeing 4 times more boost cards, 4 times more encounter cards. This means standard 3, quote-unquote, punishes, multiplayer much more than solo play. Standard 3 is at its easiest in solo play and at its hardest in 4-player. You'll just be seeing a lot more nemesis stuff a lot more often because it's just 4 times as much chance to get counters, but it doesn't even scale up. It hasn't even doubled the amount of counters you need by the time you get to 4-player, despite, getting 4 times as much counters added. So yeah, pretty crazy in that front. So we've established that standard 3 brings your nemesis a lot more often in the solo play, unless you're using rush strategies, and a lot more often in multiplayer. But it gets a little bit worse, because a lot of these standard 3 cards have boost effects which add a counter. This is part of what makes it consistent, and this was taken into account for the, the chart and things we just looked at. But what it doesn't take into account is how this affects your nemesis set. So if a boost effect brings in your nemesis, because you're at that stage of the villain phase most of the time after the villain activates to get a boost card, it means your nemesis minion basically has quick strike, but then you're still going to get an encounter card in the last step of the villain phase. So standard 1, if you're seeing your nemesis, it's just an encounter card. Standard 3, it could come in from a boost effect, meaning the minion attacks and you're still getting another actual encounter card, which is terrifying. That is a huge spike in difficulty. So between the frequency of seeing your nemesis more and the quite, fairly likely chance to see it as a boost effect, there are 4 chances of this, 4 cards of it in standard 3. Standard 3, I think, at this point of what we've looked at, has a massive boost in difficulty compared to standard 1. And apologies if I'm struggling. It's very hot here in the UK, and we haven't discovered air conditioning yet. Um, we do have some things slightly in Standard 1's favor. Nowhere is safe is the copy of Caught Off Guard. You have to discard an upgrade or support if it's revealed. But whereas if you don't have an upgrade or support out at all with Standard 1, Caught Off Guard surges, Nowhere is safe. It doesn't say anything happens there. We then have Evil Alliance, which is one of the big differences between Standard 1 and Standard 3. Standard 3 has this instead of Shadow of the Past, basically, which adds a bunch of counters on to Pursued by the Past. It does also make Nemesis minions activate, but that's fairly uncommon, especially in solo play. It adds 3 counters on. If you have 0 counters on and you need 4 counters, this can add 3 counters and then nothing else happens. So sometimes it's kind of a free encounter card. It's kind of a little break. It gives you a breather, but I'd also say that's fairly uncommon. Not super infrequent in solo play, and maybe a bit more common in multiplayer, but I would say that's kind of offset by the increased chance to get a Nemesis in multiplayer, and in solo play, I definitely think the significantly increased likelihood of Standard 3 bringing in Nemesis, I'd say it does still outweigh these kind of things in favor of Standard 1, but it is worth noting it's not cut and dry. There are some times and some effects which can make Standard 3 actually easier in certain circumstances, and this is kind of amplified with rush decks, because if Evil Alliance throws on 3 counters and you're going to win on the next turn, it doesn't matter that Shadow of the Past, your Nemesis coming to play is now a lot more likely because you probably just won. And there's also situations where, and I actually had this a day or 2 ago, I mentioned it on Discord, shoutouts if you're there, links down below, you can join. Dark Designs was my encounter card. If it made the villain scheme, I would have lost the game. Mojo had gone crazy and there was threat everywhere, he had almost, won. But instead, because it was the final pursuit counter that I added on, my Nemesis came out instead. The villain didn't scheme, and I just won immediately on the next turn. Just ignored my Nemesis there and, got the victory. So, while generally Dark Designs, going from Advanced to Shadow of the Past, I'd say it's generally worse. There are times when not getting Advanced basically revealed is going to help you out. So a few things, again, slightly in favor of Standard 1. Then we have Gang Up versus Drawing Nearer. This is the single biggest change between Standard 3 and Standard 1 in terms of the cards in rotation. Gang Up makes the villain activate against you and makes minions engage with you activate. Well, this means that villains that are really good at attacking are even scarier. So, if Gang Up is pulled from Ronan, Ronan is going to hurt you. Compared this to actually Mojo, who I just mentioned, who has very low attack, Gang Up's not that bad at all. So this does vary per scenario, but generally, the villain attacking you is another chance to lose the game immediately. But also, if you're in a good position, let's say you have an ally out that can block, if you can efficiently block with allies or status cards, attacks are actually some of the easiest things and cheapest encounter cards to deal with overall in terms of what's generally in rotation, especially against harder villains. If I can deal with an encounter card just by exhausting a 1 health ally, that's super easy. But if I don't have any allies, you can lose the game, which makes activations very hard to rank in terms of difficulty. But Gang Up is kind of a card that kicks you when you're down, because if you've been overrun by minions, you've not been able to clear the board, is the most likely situation that would have happened. All those minions are going to activate as well, and that's kind of awful. So Gang Up hits you when you're down. Drawing Nearer, on the other hand, is very different. Gang Up gets you attacked. Drawing Nearer is just an obligation, which is removed by going Alter Ego and taking an action there. So Gang Up punishes you for being in hero form by getting you attacked. Drawing Nearer, it kind of wants you to go Alter Ego, which is a really fascinating difference between them. But here's the thing with Drawing Nearer. It basically makes you discard a card from your deck and add typically 1 pursuit counter every turn. There are games where that won't matter, where maybe your Nemesis already entered play, the whole thing's reset, then you get Drawing Nearer, and the game is not going to go on enough turns to really make a difference. If it's convenient for me to go Alter Ego and remove it, I will. And since I play mostly 2-player these days, that's a lot easier for me than the average solo player. Whereas sometimes I will just leave it. Definitely in solo play, sometimes I will just do that. It will depend on when it comes up. But it's a card that will make Shadow of the Past kind of a lot more likely. It will keep giving you those counters if you don't get rid of it. And it might even immediately put on the last counter after you get it, so you immediately have to deal with your Nemesis and then the counters are building up again. But it is kind of ignorable at the same time and low impact. So I would say in general, Gang Up is slightly worse than Drawing Nearer, But if you're a character that doesn't like to go alter ego, drawing near is a little bit worse. If you get this on Drax near the start of the game and you don't think you can win that quickly, which Drax normally is going to win quick or lose quick, but it's just interesting to note the difference in that regard. And that concludes our kind of analysis of each different card here, and let's see where that leaves us in conclusion. So with standard 3 in solo play, in the first 3 or so turns, the nemesis set is far rarer. So if you like to rush, if you like to play aggression in solo, you're going to see your nemesis set even less with standard 3. Standard 1 also has an extra attack activation, it has gang up, so that is a big difference, whereas standard 3 has an obligation, but you can sometimes ignore it. Generally for me, this means standard 1 is slightly actually harder than standard 3 there. So that's kind of interesting as well. Evil Alliance can be a free encounter card as well sometimes. So long story short, if you win very, very quickly, standard 3, slightly easier. Then we can look at it from the other way though. If the game lasts, 5 or more turns, which I would say most games do, especially for most people, especially on expert, especially in multiplayer, when you have to dedicate more resources to threat removal and things like that, you're going to see your nemesis just significantly more often, which I think is overall going to be a spike in difficulty, especially as the nemesis has a pretty high chance to enter play from a boost effect, which is kind of, not exactly, but kind of like them having a surge and quick strike, which is pretty shocking. So definitely worth keeping that in mind. And for my money, the increased, significantly increased likelihood of getting standard 3, and then the chance to get it as a boost effect, the nemesis that is just huge for me. And despite a couple of things maybe being slightly easier, I think this is just so much more overwhelmingly more difficult. So for my money, I think standard 3 is more difficult, but easier for rush, in solo play specifically. However, I also think standard 3 is more fun. I like to see the nemesis there. I think it's underutilized. Some games I'll play, I just won't see it at all. I can play the same hero 3 times, maybe I don't see it. Very, very annoying when I'm testing a new hero to review on the channel, and I'm like, I'm going to have to keep going until I find it. So I like that. I also think having one less attack and instead having something that kind of incentivizes you going alter ego is more interesting. I think alter ego is underutilized. I like seeing something that drives you alter ego more. So I think that's kind of fun as well. And I like the gradual increase of counters, the way you can kind of see your nemesis coming. I think that's a lot more interactive than everything's fine, then suddenly everything just goes wrong out of the blue with this encounter card that is way worse than the average encounter card, which is Shadow of the Past I'm talking about here from standard 1. So I do like that. Now, the downside here is twofold. Something that I actually haven't put on the screen here is that you do have to manage an amount of counters with standard 3. Slightly more upkeep, it's going to take slightly more of your brain space, slightly more time to do so. It's quite minor in my opinion, especially once you've used it a few times, especially if you usually play at 1 player count and don't have to worry about remembering exactly how many counters you need to be checking for every time, but it is a factor. The other point is, it's worse if you really hate your nemesis, and what I mean by this is, if you like to play Phoenix or Venom, who both have quite nasty nemesis sets, for example, or dare I say it, Valkyrie, you're going to see your nemesis a lot more often. It's going to be a lot worse for you. So overall, with all these points combined, if you like to rush and you want to make it easier, use standard 3. If you don't like to rush, you like to play at more of a regular pace of the game, and you want to make things harder, then use standard 3. If your nemesis is absolutely awful and you really don't want to see them too often as you think it might skew the play experience, really mostly talking about like Valkyrie Phoenix here, but it can, affect a couple of others, Groot, Quicksilver, even Captain America in multiplayer, his nemesis is terrible. If that might bother you, you'll have less of a chance of that with standard 1. Maybe stick with that. So hopefully this has been interesting. Let me know what you guys think. Has this affected how you see the nemesis sets? And I should actually say, I did a poll kind of recently about how people view the difficulty of standard 3. And while more people thought it was more difficult than easy, most people thought it was about the same. For me, I do think standard 3 is harder. What do you think? Are you one of the people that voted in that poll, and have you changed your mind seeing this? But yeah, that does it. Like, comment, subscribe, links down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.